Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're going back to 1964. We're going to be taking a look at Cliff Richard and he's going to be performing constantly and he's backed by the Shadows, of course. And earlier, it blew my mind to think of the fact that maybe some people in the USA haven't heard of Cliff Richard. When I was looking into the chart positions in the USA and the UK, Cliff has been in the charts for decades here, 5 decades in a row. He got to #1, and in the UK singles chart, he's the 3rd most successful act of all time, behind Elvis Presley, #1, and the Beatles at #2. 3rd is Cliff Richard. So to think of such a massive artist potentially not being known, as I said, it blew my mind earlier. But let's get into this performance and get Sir Cliff Richard up on screen with the Shadows and see how he gets on.
I think about you constantly, just like an ever-flowing stream. Your memory haunts me constantly. Shadows fall and I try to drive you from my mind, so you're no longer near to me. But my heart sees you there with me. Every sunset you share with me. The rain that patters through the trees reminds me of you constantly. Your name is whispered by the breeze, and lovebirds bring your song to me. Just as sure as each star keeps burning in the sky, your love will stay aflame in me. A flame that burns so bright, not only through the night, but constantly. Just as sure as each star keeps burning in the sky, your love will stay aflame in me. A flame that burns so bright, not only through the night, but constantly. Though we may be far apart, you're constantly deep in my heart.
And there we have it. So with this particular composition, the performance, it's short because we're talking about early 60s here, as I mentioned in other videos, how the songs tended to be around 2.5 minutes to 3 minutes long. In fact, this whole show is just a half an hour show, as you can see from the video, 30 minutes and 25 seconds, and there's 11 songs that they go through, and the songs were crammed full of top musicianship, but also top vocal ability. With this performance, it is so stripped back, and Cliff's voice is so under the spotlight here. The vocal ability on show in terms of pitch and control is second to none because there is nowhere to hide. The other thing, just to give a shout out to the arrangement that the Shadows are laying down here, because on the original recording, it's a full orchestra sound that we get. So this arrangement, it sounds like, if you're hearing this for the first time, that this is what the record sounded like and they're just reproducing it live, whereas that is far from the case. So with the arrangement, the rhythm guitar arpeggiating the chords, and that's Bruce Welch, by the way. We've got Hank just embellishing that sound with his lead work, and Hank's sound does have a lot of reverb, so it just sits it in that mix really nicely behind Cliff's vocal. I've mentioned about Cliff's accuracy pitch-wise with his singing. He is always spot on with his pitch, but also the expression, the way that he's got a distinct vibrato. Again, something that I mentioned about that technique is going to give a singer or a player of an instrument a very particular personality through that instrument and give them their own voice, because that's the expression that comes at the end of the note. So Cliff has that unique vibrato to his voice, where it is that combination of changing the pitch, but also just a hint of that tremolo in there, where there's a little bit more air coming through the sound, as well as changing the pitch with the vibrato. Anyone that knows Cliff Richard will know that he started off with more of a rock and roll edge, being heavily influenced by Elvis throughout his whole career, but especially early on, and he makes no secret of that. But then moving on to his later years and mid-60s, turning more towards pop, and that's certainly the way that he goes with his sound. That vibrato isn't wide, and it's something that you will find in classical music that I've demonstrated before, having that a very wide vibrato, whereas Cliff has such an easy to listen to voice, and it's that control of the vibrato. He's got the tone as well. Such a unique expression to his voice, especially when he gets low down in his chest voice. We get that in this particular performance. I've never ever heard a song where it sounds like he's straining or he can't quite get the note. He maintains exactly the same tone throughout his range. And that is an art in itself, to get your vocal ability to that point where you have a consistent vocal and there aren't any breaks in your voice and it doesn't sound like a different person singing when you go to the top of your range and then when you go to the bottom of your range. Another thing about Cliff Richard's voice is that when he's speaking, you can hear how closely the tone is related with his singing voice. And that's what gets the connection, as well as the control, the expression, the vibrato, is having that talking quality to the voice. And that's why it never sounds like it's strained, because Cliff's just using his voice exactly how it was designed. Singing a ballad like this, being under the spotlight, having the vocals so up front, really does highlight the ability of some singers, and it will also highlight the shortcomings of other singers. Something that Cliff does here, which really does make it so interesting the whole way through, is his dynamic control and the changes that he goes through with his voice. You can rewind it a little bit if you want to. I think around 15 minutes and 30 in this particular video, if you want to start from the beginning, because you can start to listen to where Cliff leans into his vocal, just applies a little bit more volume and then pulls back. It's exactly the same thing for the shadows in the background. Listen to the way they change their dynamics throughout the whole performance. So we've got a great dynamic range here with the singer Cliff out front and the band. And when you get those two things aligning, that's when you get some great performances, because there is a full expression from the band, and those two things are happening independently, but then they come together at the same time so that the singer and the band are one. Let me just throw in here at this point as well that the Shadows were a hugely successful band in their own right, and they signed to EMI, so they were recording artists, and they would occasionally throw in vocals, mostly instrumental. But in this performance, this whole show, you'll be able to hear how accurate the backing vocals are with the harmonies. Really impressive stuff across the board here in terms of the band being able to supply top musicianship, but also vocally supplying those harmony lines. It's something that so many bands in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, back in the day, and the 50s, where they all had the ability to play an instrument to a really high level, but they could also sing. Just to mention as well that I have a separate video on Hank Marvin if you want to check out his playing independently, but having a look at his playing in this video, he's still applying a little bit of that whammy bar to his chord shapes and the lead. He does apply a little bit of vibrato on the fretboard, but certainly that whammy bar is the sound that he cut out for himself at this part of his career and into the future. Another thing to mention about Hank's solos, but also the rhythm play that he throws in there, and the Shadows as a whole, is how tasteful they are with the way that they play, especially considering now Cliff Richard is the focus at the front of the stage, and the way that they hold back never crossing over that dynamic line is something that is so important as a backing band, to make sure that you don't overstep the mark, that you're not too loud, you're not overemphasizing what you're playing and not playing too much as to overshadow the lead vocalist, because in this kind of composition it's imperative that the lead vocal gets to shine and you're not distracted by any particular instrument or the band just being really bad dynamically. The Shadows would have played a set before Cliff came on. That's what they used to do. Having that control and that restraint with your playing and appreciation of all the other members in the band is such an important thing, and it's the only way you can get performances that reach this level, because everybody's on the same page and have a mutual respect for each other as musicians, and the music is the focus. It's not about trying to show off. It all starts with the rhythm section. I always say that has got to be solid, but we've got Brian Bennett here on drums. Again, it all starts with the drummer. If you've got a drummer who hasn't got a feel for the composition, they can easily overstep that mark dynamically and just play a little bit too heavy-handed. But spot on here from Brian. Also, we got John Rostill here on bass. And just look at the way that John is playing so restrained to the point where you almost can't hear the bass because it is so lightly in there, which is exactly what the composition requires in order for Cliff's vocal to stay up front. The last thing you want is an overpowering bass in your face in a ballad of this nature. But just to put the spotlight back on Cliff, because he does play guitar as well. He got his first guitar when he was 16 years of age, and you might have seen him playing and singing at the same time on an acoustic. And his first real hit in 1958 was called Move It, and that was the song that John Lennon said was the first authentic British rock and roll track, and that everything else that came before that wasn't really worth listening to. In 1959 is when Cliff released Living Doll, and that got to number 1 here in the UK, and it broke into the top 40 in the US charts. The only problem being that the Shadows were actually called the Drifters at that time, so they broke into the US charts under the name The Drifters, but of course the record label that had signed and were in control of The Drifters in the USA made sure that the backing band to Cliff changed their name to avoid any confusion. Cliff wanted to, with a lot of other artists, extend it to 95 years, but that failed in court, unfortunately. Don't know why. Well, I do know why, because of record labels and money, but thankfully it was extended to 70 years. So it means that once you've written a song for then 70 years, as soon as it is published, you will own the rights to that song. So thankfully for most of the rest of your life, if you write it at a young age and if you write it at a later age, then you will be covered. So in the early 60s, Cliff was a massive star here in the UK, was also making inroads in the late 50s, early 60s in the US charts, but when the British invasion came along, he wasn't part of those bands, and it might have been the fact that he was seen as a solo artist, that he didn't have the same impact on the charts as the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, the Who. It might have been also that his sound had mellowed somewhat by the mid-60s. But the other thing about Cliff Richard in the early 60s was that he was making movies, very much the English version, the UK version of Elvis Presley, making movies to the point where his films were called Cliff Richard musicals and were a bigger box office smash than the Bond films at that time. So everyone was going to watch Cliff Richard movies in the UK more so than the James Bond movies. Cliff is the kind of guy that has had such a long and successful career, it's going to be impossible for me to cover everything in this video, but I want to cover a few more points, because between 1960 and 1965, Cliff had 23 consecutive top 10 hits. Everything he released went into the top 10 for 5 years, which is a standalone record in itself in the UK charts. As you can imagine, anyone trying to beat that is really going to struggle. Cliff had his own TV show here in the UK that ran for 6 years between 1970 and 1976. He was also releasing music throughout this whole period, charting really highly the whole time. In 1976, he released I'm Nearly Famous, and that had the single on there called Devil Woman, and that was a return to the original rock sound and had a bit of an edge to it, and guys were seen wearing the badge of the album I'm Nearly Famous, Elton John, also Jimmy Page, Eric Clapton. So it had that connection to those rock and roll roots that he had in the late 50s, and in the 70s and especially 1980, he had a bit of an impact on the US charts. There was a song called Carrie, which did really well. I think that got into the top 40 in the US charts, but then Dreamin' got into the top 10 of the charts over in the USA. In 1988, he had a massive Christmas #1 here in the UK, and that was called Mistletoe and Wine. And we're talking about my childhood here, one of those songs that you could not avoid because it was such a monster hit. And talking of monsters, in 1989, he released his album, Stronger Monster. Some of you might have seen the footage from Wimbledon, where, if you don't know what Wimbledon is, it's a place in London, but it's also a tennis competition that they have every year, and Cliff is a massive tennis fan, and he plays, and it's always raining around that time. Fortunately now they've got a roof so they can cover the courts, and they can still keep on playing. Not on the outside courts, but that's a whole nother thing. Anyway, it just so happened that it was raining, they didn't have the roof at this point, so Cliff Richard was in the audience, and he just had a microphone and would entertain the whole crowd whilst they're waiting for it to stop raining. And for me, that encapsulates Cliff Richard as a personality, as somebody that is so likable that he can turn the Wimbledon crowd who aren't there to listen to Cliff Richard, but he can get everybody on side and get everybody involved so that everyone's having a great time. Something really interesting happened in the late 90s with Cliff Richard because he wasn't getting any radio airplay, not because the music wasn't good enough, because the radio stations didn't think he was cool enough or edgy enough for the kind of music they were wanting to play. As always, the music industry isn't about the music, it's about image, it's about making money. In 1998, Cliff Richard did something amazing to highlight this fact. He released a single or a remix of a future single and gave it to radio stations, but he didn't put anything on the record, so it's just a white label, and the alias was Black Knight in terms of the only thing that the radio stations knew about this record, and they loved it, and they all started playing it because they didn't know it was Cliff Richard. As soon as it was announced that the record they were playing was Cliff Richard's, they all took it off the air. And it proved the point that it's not about the music. Another thing is that Absolute Radio here in the UK is a radio station that is, I'm going to say their tagline, dedicated to playing the hits of the 60s and all of those old-time classics, apart from, of course, Cliff Richard, because he's uncool and he's not the kind of image we want to promote with our radio station. When we're talking about hits of the 60s, you cannot avoid Cliff Richard in the UK. Like I said, he had so many number ones. He had number ones in 5 separate decades. He sold over 250 million albums worldwide. And let's bear in mind that Cliff wasn't massive in the USA. So those 250 million record sales are mostly from other countries that are nowhere as big as the USA. Imagine if he'd been a massive artist there as well. The sales figures would have been ridiculous. Cliff campaigned for increasing the duration of the copyright law. As the music industry is run, or used to be run, which isn't a surprise really, that copyrights only lasted for 50 years. But when you're an artist like Cliff Richard, who has had a number one in 5 consecutive decades in the UK charts, it means that he is still selling a hell of a lot of copies of a song that he might have written 50 years ago and performed. And he would lose the rights to all of those royalties after 50 years, how the old music industry used to be. So then a music company and a record label, publishing company would then buy the rights to somebody's music, and they would take all of the royalties, therefore leaving the original writer and performer, the original artist of that music, would be getting nothing. I don't want this video to go on for too long, but Cliff Richard throughout his whole career has done so many things that highlight the gulf between artists, musicians, and the music industry, the guys in the suits that are making the money off the back of the artists. And in 1999, Cliff wanted to record a song called The Millennium Prayer, but the record label, EMI, at the time, said that it wasn't commercially viable, it wasn't going to be popular, so they denied releasing that track. So Cliff took that song to an independent label and he released it. And guess what? It got to #1. It was a massive hit. In 2008, Cliff teamed up with The Shadows again for the 50th anniversary. And in 2009, they released an album called Reunited. I think that Cliff Richard, in the circle of musicians and artists, is one of those guys that is so well respected because of his ability. Like I said, he plays guitar as well, but vocally having the control, all the things that I've pointed out in this video. For example, Sting said that Cliff was one of Britain's finest singers, technically and emotionally. Let's also put it in perspective that at the age of 18, that's when Cliff burst onto the scene. So he's been in the public eye for his whole life. And in order to stay so grounded, and also he does so much work for charity, he has a charitable organization that gives to over 50 charities consistently. So a tenth of everything he earns with his royalties, his income, is donated to charity automatically. Just to finish with, I've mentioned how Cliff had such a harsh deal more recently with the music industry, but also I've got to mention in 2014 where on TV we had this breaking news, and I remember because I was watching the BBC at this time, they interrupted the program to give us breaking news about Cliff Richard's house being searched and investigated for historic sex offences. And my immediate thought was, how are we getting these pictures immediately as soon as the investigation is happening? Because you saw them going into the house live. The thing is, with the way it runs in England, for some reason, I don't know why, the people are named before any evidence has been found and any proof has been found. So Cliff Richard was immediately put on TV with his name attached to these historic sex offences. And it was so crazy because at the end of the day, 2016, it was found that, oh, no, actually, it was all made up. There was no evidence. It turned out that the BBC had to pay Cliff Richard £210,000 and the police gave Cliff Richard £400,000, which is just crazy to show that it was all without any basis. And it was put on TV instantly, and it's totally out of order. It certainly had a massive effect on him as a person, because imagine that yourself going through that as somebody that is in the public eye and everybody knows who you are, to then be accused of these things having happened in the past and you know that they're totally untrue, and to have it splashed on TV. Not just TV in terms of channels that you can get if you subscribe to Sky or something. This is the BBC, which means it goes to every single house in the UK. Thankfully, it's one of those things that we can now see it for what it was, and that it was all a setup, and it's just Cliff that was on the other end of that. What a nightmare place to be. But thankfully now, we can look back at these performances and appreciate Cliff Richard as the artist, as the musician. But Cliff Richard is one of those artists whose video could go on all night, probably all year, because of the amount that he's achieved throughout his career. Thank you guys for suggesting this video for me to take a look at in the first place, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one.